All right, up next is one of TK and I's probably favorite people. But you are going to love this next speaker, Dr. Jim Coffield. He's a clinical psychologist and pastor at Christ Covenant Church. He's been a mentor, friend, just pastor to Renew Clinic. He's on our board. He was one of the foundational pieces to this ministry getting off the ground. And so with that, welcome Dr. Coffield.
And I can't even read and write, so it's amazing that any of that's true. I grew up in Manhattan, Kansas. And when I was a boy, there was a zoo in Manhattan, Kansas that was really, I was born before any of you were alive. This is like, Fred Flintstone was in my first grade class, so I'm an old man. But in Manhattan, Kansas, there was a zoo, and this is back before zoos were kind to animals and they were concerned about animals. This is way before PETA. And there was a lion in a cage, probably much smaller than the back of this thing. And they had this huge picture behind it that said, King of the Jungle, the American lion. And they had this picture of this majestic lion with its mane flowing in the wind, and in the background the Serengeti, and it was a beautiful picture. And then you looked at the lion, and the lion was just it just laid in the dirt. And the lion just laid there, matted mane. Junior high kids were throwing straws at it to try to get it to move. Never roared. And at some level, there's a lion in captivity who was made for so much more than a small little cage. And it was made for something to run to kind of go through the African plain. It was made to roar. It was made to, it was a lion. For goodness sakes, it was a lion. And that's what they had. But it learned to not get its hopes up for anything more, and it just laid there in the dirt and waited for somebody else to feed it. And that's how it lived out its life, evidently. Now you say, why are we talking about a lion in Manhattan, Kansas Zoo in 1902 at a conference on addiction? Well, I would suggest that there's a spiritual aspect of addiction that you need to understand. And if you don't get this, then you'll kind of miss the point. You don't want too much in life. The addict doesn't want too much excitement. The sex addict doesn't want too much sex. The food addict doesn't want too much food. The problem is that they just settle for too little. My problem with food is that I think Twinkies are food. My problem with food is I think a Crystal cheeseburger is food. It's garbage. And what most of us have done is that we've settled for too little instead of understanding who we are in Christ and what it means to be an image bearer of God. Well, I'll tell you what, I didn't say it near as well as C.S. Lewis did. C.S. Lewis, there's a quote, and kind of listen to this, and we're gonna base the next 20 or 30 minutes just kind of based on this quote. C.S. Lewis, one of the smartest guys in town, one of the great Christian thinker in the last century, and he said this: "It would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling around with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in the slum, but they cannot imagine what it means to have the offer of a vacation by the sea. We are far too easily pleased." As an image bearer of God, you were created for Eden and heaven. That's what you were made for. You were made to see beauty. You were made to experience relationships that mattered. You were made to live a life of purpose. You were made in the very image of God. His very thumbprint is on your design. And what's happened theologically is that because of what's called the fall, we are left homesick for Eden. We're homesick for what we were made for. They put a quote up in the last little talk Sarah did about where C.S. Lewis said, at some point in your life, you realize you were made for something more than this. And you were. You are. You, each of you, have the very thumbprint of God in your design. You were designed for dignity. That's why you like beauty. That's why you like art. That's why you like music. Because something inside you knows that there's something more. Remember that old movie, Jason Bourne, Bourne Identity. Anybody remember that movie from a few years ago? I mean, it's an old movie now. But they found him, and he had lost his memory. And he had no memory, but then as he was going through life, there was something in him that said, I know that there's something. Like he was driving a car, and he realized he knew how to drive it. And it was, where did that come from? Someone was trying to fight him, and he could immediately defend himself, and he thought, where does that come from? And somewhere inside him, he knew that it was true, that there was something more to him than what he was aware of. And that is the state we find ourselves in. We live in a world that is a fallen world, and therefore there's something wrong with everything on this side of heaven, and we're homesick for Eden, we're homesick for heaven, we're homesick for what we were made for. You don't want too much. You settle way too much for too little. What does it say in Romans 5? It says that Jesus is a hope that doesn't disappoint. And no, it's kind of fun to be in Knoxville, Tennessee this time of the year. Because you just need to listen to talk to sports radio for about 3 minutes. And it is and people have this hope, like Nico's going to win the Heisman, and we're going to win the national championship. And it's like this fever of, but I guarantee you, well, I pretty well could guarantee you that it's going to be a hope that disappoints. Because it's a hope based on, it's just a hope based on things that aren't true. We are terrified of hope. And so what happens, since we're half-hearted creatures, afraid of what we were made for, yet we know that there's something greater, something better. And what do we do with that tension? That tension between, I was made for this and I experienced this. I was made for beauty and glory. I was made to have a life that had a purpose. I was made to have a sense that my life echoed into eternity. I was made as image bearers of God, as people with a soul. You are an eternal being. That means you last forever. You're not and it's like, how do we deal with that? I'm just trying to survive till tomorrow. And God declares me something so much more than I know what to do with. And so we got to figure out a way to deal with that. And one of the ways we tend to deal with that is that we just create a world and we settle for less. You know, in the psychological world, there's a syndrome called the Stockholm Syndrome. Do you know what that is? That's where someone who's a captive of something ends up developing an incredible relationship with and a dependency on and even a love for its very captor. If that's not a description of addiction, I don't know what is. The very thing that I'm a slave to becomes the thing that I end up having an unusual affection for because it's providing needs for me. People that are lost in the sex trade world, They have some affinity to the people that are trafficking them because they're providing food for them and they're providing safety. At least they think it's providing safety, and so they get this odd relationship with the very thing that's destroying them, and they lose sight of who they are. They lose sight of what they're created for, and in that, they almost cease to be human. And so, the idea today is that we're going to spend just a few minutes talking about the idea that we're far too easily pleased. We lived in Florida for years, and we got a husky at the dog shelter. And huskies are made for the Arctic. I mean, they actually have fur on their paws so that their paws won't get too cold in the snow. And we lived in Orlando, Florida, which is similar to the surface of the sun. And this dog, when it was the few days of the year that it was cool, that the weather was cool and it wasn't humid, and this dog would go outside and there was a little bit of a breeze, you would see something in the dog's face. It was like it would sniff in the air and it would hold its head up. And there'd be this sense that this husky knew I wasn't made for sand and heat. I was made for the Arctic world. I was made to pull sleds. I was made to save people in the snowstorms. Instead, I'm sitting here in a sandbar, and it's hot, and I'm just laying down. Will somebody feed me? I don't know where you are in your journey of addiction. I don't know where you are in your spiritual journey. But I want you to know that you're an image bearer of God and you were made for more. And what you tend to do is create a world based on relief and revenge that'll allow you to settle for less because you don't want to get your hopes up that maybe you really could be, maybe you really are, maybe your life really could echo into eternity. And that scares us. And so we play it safe. And we live a lesser life. And we find ourselves in addictions. We find ourselves lost. Well, just a couple of things to go through. Settle for too little. Lewis suggests that our desires are not too strong, but that are too weak. In the context of addiction, that means that people often settle for temporary and shallow pleasure instead of imagining a deeper, more fulfilling, and sometimes more mysterious pleasure we would find in knowing God. He says also in the quote that we're half-hearted creatures. Half-hearted creatures that produce lesser, that seek lesser things. I just want to suggest to you that there's two things that energize an addiction: desire for relief and a desire for revenge. Relief from what? Relief from the longings, the deep, deep longings that you have. Most of us don't acknowledge how deeply our heart is wired, how much we long for connection, how much we long for love, how much we know, how much we long to belong. Yes, even the things that they were showing you earlier, they talked about attachment theory, and that sounds so smart and kind of, psychological and wise. All that is that God made you. I mean, he formed you to be connected to him and to others. You are a relational being. You're created by a relational God who made you for a relationship. That's inside you. One of the deepest longings in a human being is to belong, is to connect, is to know and to be known. Those are the deepest movements and motivations of our hearts. And what happens in a fallen world? People hurt us, people abandon us, people shame us, and so we feel like what we deeply long for is too much. So I'm going to create an easier world. I'm going to find a less wild lover than God. I'm going to find something that I can control, or I think I can control, to meet those longings inappropriately instead of taking those deepest of longings to the one who created you, that knows you. And so, you were made for more. And deep inside, every one of you know that. I've got a 37-year-old autistic son who's kind of forever 7. But he knows that he's made for more. Because I didn't teach him that. God put that in him. He may not be able to read, but he knows that he wants to do something that has a purpose. And whenever we do something that he feels like he's done something that matters, boy, his chest sticks out. This past week we were at a camp where he had a best buddy and he was treated with dignity. And he came home with his chest out thinking like, he realized for just a moment, because of that dignity, he realized, I'm an image bearer of God and my soul matters. And because of that, I'm made for more. You don't want too much. You settle for too little. The guy at the strip club tonight, it's not that he wants too much sex. What he does is he mistakes a stranger pretending she's interested for real connection and real intimacy and real love. When I grab my bucket of bean burritos from Taco Bell, the pornography of the fast food industry, it's not that I want too much. It's that I settle for stuff that probably is not even food. And I call that food and I say, that's supposed to satisfy my soul. It satisfies almost nothing. And you just need more and more and more because you're settling for less. You're finding a God that you can control. You're finding a relief that you can control instead of trusting a God you can't. So, let's talk about this idea of we have a desire for relief. Relief from what? Relief from our deepest longings. As I was saying, we're made for deep connection with God and with others. For our desire for dignity in a world that's incredibly selfish and broken. You take your longing for dignity to this world, how will that go? Oh, people turn their back and so we're stuck with, I've got to protect myself, but I want love. I've got to protect myself, I want love. And we end up just trying to figure out a way to control those deep longings without having to really face and live in them. So our addictions, they are fueled and they keep going by a desire for relief, a desire for being homesick for Eden. Second thing, they're fueled by a desire for revenge. Ultimately, all of us live with a deep disappointment. Disappointment is a vulnerable feeling, and so we don't stay disappointed very long. That shifts to anger. And anger has us, I want revenge. I want someone to pay for the things I'm disappointed about. I want someone to pay for my hurt. I want someone to pay for the things that are broken and wrong. And I just want revenge. I want someone to pay. Some of us try to make ourselves pay because we give ourselves what we think we deserve usually. Some people try to make others pay. Some people try to make God pay. But there's this sense of, I want revenge. And if I'm if I'm lost in my addiction, if I'm lost in my escapism, our addictions are not about passion, they're about escape. They're about a choice to live in a world that's easier to manage, and then it starts to manage you. I mean, all of our addictions work until they don't, and then when they don't, you're in the Stockholm syndrome. You end up developing a relationship with the very thing that's hurting you, and you hold on to it. It holds on to you and doesn't let go. I would suggest to you that if we're going to face our desires, they're bigger than you, they're bigger than me. Our desires seem dangerous. It'd be dangerous if I really got in touch with what I really want. I'd get my hopes up and then I'd be disappointed. Also, our desires are regularly disappointed. They're in a fallen world, things don't work the way we'd want. And so we have disappointment, which turns to anger, which turns to rage, which turns to revenge. And we have this fear, of the dangerousness of what we really long for. And so we end up living in a tension of a dance between dread and deadness. So we flee our deepest desires and succumb to shame and contempt. We flee our deepest desires and we develop relationships with substances or things or people that we think are safer than trusting God with those deepest longings inside us. Boy, it'd be helpful if you would spend a little bit of time this week saying, what are my deepest longings? What was I made for? Well, most of us are just surviving. Most of us are just surviving. And God didn't create you to just survive. He created you to reflect His glory with His life. He created you in a sense that you would have purpose, that your life would matter. He doesn't need you. He wants you. Jesus doesn't save you to use you. He saved you because He loves you. And He's made you for more. Well, as we think about this idea of fear and this idea that we embrace shame, we seek relief, what's our hope? Well, obviously our hope is in Christ, but what does that mean when it comes to this sort of addiction? I'm going to spend just a moment in a passage that you're going to say, well, that's not really that's not really a passage about addiction, and it's not. It's a passage about living life. It's found Hebrews 12:1 and 2. Just spend a second there. I'm not going to preach at you. It's just something that helps me when I think through about what would it mean to live my life differently. What would it mean for me to live life on God's terms instead of my terms? What would it mean to step away from the lesser addictions and move toward the real, my real affection and longing for affection, which would be Christ? And so you got to understand this book of Hebrews, he had just gone through, it's a very theological book, and he had just listed all these important people, all these great heroes of the faith. He had just listed all these people that, as a matter of fact, Hebrews 11 is sometimes called the heroes of the faith chapter, and people just lists all these people. You don't need to know all that, but just need to know that as the context for what this begins. And so he's listed all these people, and then he says this. And this is just advice on how we live. How then should I live? And it says this. Therefore, enter passcode. Therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, Let us lay down every weight and sin that clings to us so closely, and let us run with endurance the race set before us. Stop for just a second. Since we're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, I used to hear that preached out of shame, and people would say things like, don't mess up because people are watching you. Don't mess up because people are paying attention to you. That's not the context of this. This is a context that you're not alone in this journey in sobriety. You're not alone in this journey to live a life not of survival, but a life of glory for God. You're not alone in that. As a matter of fact, people are cheering you on. When you stumble, when you relapse, when you start living for less, when you're homesick for Eden, when you're angry, when you're wanting relief and revenge instead of hope and life, you're not alone. There's a great cloud of witnesses that have gone before you, and they're cheering you on. They're not saying, don't mess up. You don't belong here. You're going to screw up again. They're saying, you got this. Christ is in you, and because he's in you, you've got this. Just a quick story, it's 3 minutes, but it's kind of funny. Is when you look at me, most of you would say, he must be an elite athlete. Okay, I know that no one would think that. I've run one race in my life. It was the New York City Marathon in 1998, before most of you were born. And I had no business running this race. 4 obese men sitting in a room together said, we ought to do something that would be healthy. And one of them said, why don't we run a marathon? That was a real genius group. And I was one of those obese men, and they said, let's all sign up for a marathon. And so we signed up for the New York City Marathon. I'm the only one that got through. And so now here I am 6 months later, getting ready to run the New York City Marathon. I had no business being there. I'm wearing basketball shorts and I had 2 little goals that day. I wanted to get into Central Park before the sweet bus, because they bring the bus through, starting in Staten Island. They bring the bus through because they've got to open the roads back up in New York City. And then I wanted to pass somebody in the last mile. That was it. That's my only goal. I was so slow. I got passed by a guy in a gorilla suit. There was a guy in the last mile. I was just kind of stumbling last mile, and he was juggling. And he juggled the whole way through. But I want to tell you, toward the end of that race, I was dead man walking. And I'll never forget it. I was running through, when we went through Harlem, all the black churches opened their doors. It was on a Sunday morning, and the black choirs, they came out and they sang for us as we ran. You don't know how encouraging that is. I'll never forget, toward the end, I must have looked pretty bad, and I'm running, or I'm really stumbling forward slowly, and somebody yelled a number on your jersey or chest, and somebody yelled my number and said, don't give up, you've got this. And then somebody said, hey, you in the blue shorts. Nobody said, hey, you don't belong here, chubby. This is for elite athletes. You have no business being here. Who do you think you are running a race like this? Nobody said that. There was a cloud of witnesses that were saying, you've got this. I would never have made it that far. Come on, don't give up now. Christ is in you, and there's a great cloud of witnesses that are cheering you on. And if you're going to make this journey, if you're going to go from living a life of lesser than the life that you were made for as an image bearer of God that was made for Eden, you've got to know you're not alone in that journey. Second thing, notice that the author in Hebrews compares it to a race. A race is not an easy and not a passive thing. It requires you to move and to do something. But the truth is, everybody's in a race. And you're either going to race alone or you're going to race for him. And everybody is going to suffer. Everybody's going to struggle. Suffering is a part of what it means to live in a fallen world. And you're either going to suffer alone and it's going to have no meaning, or your suffering will matter in the kingdom of God. We're going to talk about suffering for just a moment, because at the core, an addiction is a refusal to struggle and to sorrow and to suffer. And a lot of people say, well, why does God let people suffer? God allows what he hates in order to produce what he loves. And what God, the idea of, you've got to understand that all suffering and all suffering comes from sin, not necessarily your personal sin, but when sin entered the world, that's when death entered, and loneliness entered, and brokenness and disease. That's when all that entered. And so if you were to say, God, take away all the suffering today, God then closes the window on, if he takes away all the suffering, then that closes the window of anybody else knowing him. So one of the reasons suffering remains is because the door is still open for people to know Jesus. The door is still open for you and for me to know Jesus. Because if he took all suffering away, that door shuts. Second reason I think God allows suffering is, have you ever been next to a swimming pool and you get splashed? Suffering is the splash over from hell that comes into our world to remind us that there really is hell. And there really is a way in which that splash over of hell, when the water of it comes around your feet, you realize there really is a long eternal suffering that I don't want to be a part of. There's also the splash of heaven that comes in this fallen world that kind of says, oh, I was made for beauty and for glory and for more. And we live in between these two pools, and the suffering is the splash over from hell. And I want to tell you, as a father of an autistic son, when I think of being separated from God, when I think of being connected and healed, there's nothing in this world that doesn't make me long for the day that he's fully clothed in his right mind and he'll be okay. That'll take place in heaven. So I live in between these two pools where God in his grace, and by the way, he does give common grace and keeps us from being as evil as we could be. Most of us have been places where people are evil. Some of us have been evil at times in our lives. And we know that that's not how people normally or usually are, and that's because of God's common grace on all of the world. Because if we were as bad as we could be, we'd live in constant fear. Constant fear. Instead, we live with God's common grace that's keeping evil at bay a little bit, but allows enough suffering, for some a lot, that's a splash over of hell, to remind us of the eternal realities, and the splash over of heaven that reminds us that there's glory and hope. Third reason that I think God allows suffering is that God does have the ability to use suffering to produce good things. Remember this, God is never the author of evil. He's never. God is not the author of evil, but God can use evil for good. Because even the hardest of things can be used for good. I mean, a caterpillar and a butterfly have the exact same DNA. What's the difference? Well, the butterfly went through a dark cocoon and had to fight its way out. And fighting its way out, its wings became strong enough to fly. But the DNA is the same. The DNA of the caterpillar and the DNA of the butterfly are the exact same. The difference is that the caterpillar, after it's gone through dark suffering and struggle, becomes strong and resilient and has beauty. So the third reason I think God allows suffering to be in our lives is because he has a way, he's never the author of evil, but he has a way of taking that suffering and struggle and using it for glory. Because suffering and struggle has a shelf life on this side of heaven. And there will be a day. If you want a happy ending to your story, be careful where you stop the story. Because God is ultimately going to tell a story of glory and beauty the picture we were looking at in Hebrews 12, quickly, it says, therefore we're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. So let us lay aside every weight and every sin that clings so closely. Two things there. We're supposed to let go of the things that hinder us. Those aren't necessarily sins. Those could be anything. Today, for me, what hinders me is watching too much, being on the internet too much and watching news that's not helpful. So I'm going to let go of that hinders. Then the second thing it says you should let go of is sin that so easily entangles us. That's addiction. Addiction, we can easily get entangled in addiction because of what we think it's doing for us until it doesn't anymore. And then the passage goes on to say, it's pretty impressive, my technological skills as I working my phone. It's pretty amazing. We're supposed to let go of the sin that clings so closely. Let us run with endurance the race set before us. Last two things, and we're almost done. The race set before you means the race you have. You don't compare yourself to other people. You each have an individual race to run. It's not a group race. It's your individual race with God. Some of us have it easier. Some people have it harder. Some people struggle in different ways. You've got an individual race that God's inviting you to live and that he's cheering you on to live. And then it says, you always run the race looking to the finish line. And he says, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before us endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of God the Father. So what's the point that I'm trying to make for you today? I'm trying to suggest to you that you were made for more. That your problem is not that you want too much. Your problem is that you settle for too little. That each person in this room is an image bearer of God and therefore has dignity and has value. And your life, your soul will last forever, for eternity. And the starting spot of recovery is not, I'm a loser in a broken down Chevy outside of town. The starting point of recovery is, I'm an image bearer of God that's made for something better than this. I wasn't made to just survive. I was made to thrive and to live for the glory of God. And I have a purpose higher than just surviving. I have a purpose of reflecting his very purposes in a broken world. I have the great purpose of helping curb the splash over of hell into this world and letting people see the splash over of glory. And that's just something I want you to think about today. Well, listen, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take about a 1-minute break, and then people much smarter than me are going to be on a panel, and they're going to, I guess, we can just answer questions and kind of do a panel. Does that make sense? Hey, remember, let me just finish with the same quote I started with from C.S. Lewis. He says this: it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong. You don't want too much, but too weak. We're half-hearted creatures fooling around with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in the slum because they cannot imagine a vacation by the sea. We are far too easily pleased. Amen.